Thanks, Dennis. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to run through a lot of material here this afternoon, but try and keep it straightforward. So if you have questions as I talk, try and remember them till the end. If we start getting involved in questions and answers during my talk, we'll be here till 8, 9 o'clock. And I don't think anybody's ordered pizza. So I'm going to talk about linking fish habitats and conservation. Strangely enough, you might think that happens all the time, but as I'll show you this afternoon, it's actually pretty rare. So I'm going to talk about fish and fisheries habitat ecology. From a purely scientific perspective, it's fish habitat ecology. So what is that? It's studies on how fish use habitats. What are the connections between habitats used by different life stages? For example, I'll show you snook use different habitats as juveniles than they do as adults. They spawn in different places than they use as a feeding area, those types of things. Trying to figure those out from a scientific perspective is what we study. We also study how changes to habitats affect the fish populations. For example, if someone comes through and dredges out a mangrove creek to make a marina, how does that affect the snook population? We also just study a lot disturbance effects, and disturbance is a very innocuous way of saying things like hurricanes. I've had the scientifically personally misfortune of having 5 studies interrupted by hurricanes thus far. And it's interesting how well the natural systems handle those types of disturbances. But going into the fisheries side of things is how can we manage what we understand about the fish, how their behavior, their habitat use, what they eat, what eats them, and put that into management and conservation and even habitat restoration. And I'll give you some examples here in a little bit. And also, what's the importance of this to local economies? Fisheries are worth a lot of money, especially in places like Florida. And today I'm going to focus on recreational fisheries. And you can see the pretty high economic impact. Wide, saltwater recreational fisheries have an annual economic impact of $7.6 billion a year. You can go into all kinds of research to look it up, but that's more than many portions of Florida's economy are due entirely to recreational fishing, whether by locals or by tourists. And you can see the breakdown there by different regions. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about all the problems with Everglades and the water mismanagement down there. And so when we hear about, say, the effects on agriculture of changing that water mismanagement, that's a big number. But $1 billion a year just for fishing in that region is a bigger number. And when that mismanagement of water also affects the Florida Keys, you can add almost another $1 billion to that. So there's a lot of money involved as well, so there's a lot of applications. The problem is that there's a mismatch between how we manage our fisheries and the information that we need in order to make sure these fish populations are around. So on the left, you see that the traditional fisheries management, jurisdictional boundaries is one. So for example, Florida manages their fisheries separately from Georgia. But what we know from tagging fish, say fish like triple tail or even tarpon, is that it's the same fish that are in both of those jurisdictions, but they're being managed separately. And that's obviously not going to work long term, so we're working to change that. Typically, fisheries scientists who do stock assessments look at things like how many fish are harvested and what they call discard mortality, which is really if you catch a fish and you let it go, if it dies, what portion die, because then they consider that in their assessment models harvested, it's out of the population. They also record a lot about fishing effort, how many people are out there trying to catch fish. If your fishing effort is going up, but your catch rates are the same or going down, that's kind of a big red light that we've got a problem, for example. And then finally, their stock assessment, how many fish are out there, how many fish can that population handle being harvested, those types of things. What's not included in almost any marine fisheries management plan is everything that's on the right, everything I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. Where do fish spawn? Once they spawn, the eggs hatch, where do the babies go? What are the nursery habitats that juveniles grow up in? As they change, like I'll show you here for snook, as they go from juvenile to subadult to adult, they use different habitats. How is that what we call the coastal habitat mosaic? So, for example, from a mangrove creek to a seagrass flat to an oyster bed to the beach. That's a whole mosaic of interrelated habitats. None of these things are involved in fisheries management right now. And the thing is, the frustration is, you take Florida, which arguably has the best marine fisheries management in the country, if not the world, and they're still having problems with fish populations because it's everything on the right that they're not addressing that are becoming problematic, which I'll show you here in some examples. So to start, before we get into the fish, I need to lay some background on what I call fisheries under threat, and that is that we're running a deficit already. So already in Florida, we've lost around 50% of our mangroves from way back when. Remember, 100 years ago, Miami as a city did not exist. It was a fish camp. 100 years ago, it did not exist. A fish camp, very small. We've already lost over 9 million acres as a percentage of the state area. That's the highest in the United States, I believe. We've already lost over 2 million acres of seagrass. I'll give you some current examples now. If you fish in the Indian River Lagoon, you know how much seagrass we've lost in the past few years. And in some locations, over 80% of oyster reefs has been lost. And these are all the habitats that fish depend upon. But again, none of this is included in the fisheries management. So the major threats to go through them, one is habitat loss and degradation. So what happens is you have a type of lagoon system like you see here, and that gets replaced by coastal development. And again, it's not that development's bad per se, but building it on uplands versus taking out the estuaries, those are two completely different impacts on the fishery. Water quality declines. Whether it's runoff from streets or from agriculture, nutrients, pesticides, herbicides, all those types of things. You get plankton blooms, and so you have nice clear seagrass bed, nice clear water seagrass like this. You get a plankton bloom. It discolors the water, which shades the seagrass. The seagrass dies because it doesn't get enough sunlight. Then you have open sand bottom, and so all those fish that depend on seagrass can't handle it anymore. We also have freshwater flow alterations, and in my opinion, this is Florida's biggest challenge. In freshwater flow alterations, it's been documented many times over many decades that if you alter the amount, the timing, and the location of where fresh water enters estuaries, you cause major ecological damage. And so you can think about, say, for example, the Indian River Lagoon, fresh water used to come into the lagoon through hundreds or thousands of small creeks. Now most of that comes in through a handful of water management canals. So they've changed not only the distribution, but also the amount that comes in all at pulse at one time, and then also what's in that water. So you take a creek like this one, which has natural flows, and you turn it into this, and this is how our water is managed now that it comes into the estuaries. All of these present challenges to the fish that support all that economic activity that I've already showed you. So here's some basic things about habitat and fisheries. In general, the amount of habitat influences fish population size, especially juvenile habitats. So let's say our snook population, if we took away all fishing, all harvest, the snook population can only get as large as the amount of habitat that's available for it. And I'll describe that habitat in a second. So even if there's no fishing, it's all about habitat. And they depend on mangroves, and we've lost 50% of our mangroves. So we'll never have as big a snook population as they had in Florida, say, 200 years ago. We just don't have the habitats. But we can do a lot better with the habitats we have. There's not only the amount, it's the quality of habitats. We could have an awesome-looking mangrove creek, but if the water in that creek is polluted, the fish aren't going to do well, and I'll show you an example of that. And the connections between those habitats that I told you about, say, from a mangrove creek to a seagrass bed to an oyster bar, if you don't have those connections, you don't support the fish life cycle, and you have problems that way as well. So I'm going to talk today about 3 different species. Snook is on the right, tarpon is on the upper one, and bonefish is on the lower left. All of these are very economically important in Florida and have received growing attention in recent years as far as their habitat requirements. But first I need to kind of describe to you the life history of marine fish very quickly. This is the only really nerdy kind of graph thing I have. So bear with me here, okay? All right, spawning. A lot of people know about, say, salmon spawning. They go up the stream, they dig a nest, they lay their eggs, the eggs hatch, all that kind of stuff, throw it out. That's not what most marine fish do. For spawning, most marine fish will get together sometimes in pairs, usually in groups, and they do what's called broadcast spawning. They eject all the eggs and sperm into the open water. The fertilization is external, and that's it for parenthood. There's no nest guarding, any of that stuff. The parents are gone. The eggs will hatch in, say, 24, 48 hours. And the little larvae that come out of them, and I'll show you pictures here during the presentation, we call it larval phase, these little baby fish float around in the open ocean for, depending on the species, anywhere from a few weeks to 3 or 4 months. Okay, and those ocean currents can carry them a lot of different places. When they come out, we call it larval settlement. They transition. They actually change shape, because the fish larvae don't look like fish for the most part. They change shape into what we would recognize as a juvenile fish, say a juvenile snook or tarpon, and they come into what we call nursery habitats. The nursery habitats support the juveniles, and over time they grow up, become subadults, then adults, and in each one of these phases, there's different processes that affect them. So when they're larvae, mortality is a huge one, and as I said, ocean currents move them a lot. Mortality for larvae is estimated over 99%, a lot of studies. But when a single female has hundreds of thousands or millions of eggs, 0.5% is still a lot of fish. For juveniles, mortality is also a really big one, right? They're small fish. Small fish get eaten by big fish, birds and everything else. But so is movement or migration. I'll talk about that. And then so on with the rest of the life cycle. So kind of keep this in mind as we move along. Another way to look at it is connect the dots, right? Back to the elementary school days. Each of those little points on that graph I just showed you is, let's say, spawning, larvae, the ocean, juvenile habitats. And so our job as fish habitat ecologists is to connect these dots. And so once we can draw the elephant, then we can provide this information to management, and they can use that to make sure we have fish in the future. So we're going to start with common snook. Snook is present through the southern half of Florida, but as we get a lot of warming trends, they're finding them more and more in northern parts of Florida. So we'll consider them a statewide fish. These are juveniles that are about 8 inches long. So, have done a lot of work over in southwest Florida in Charlotte Harbor, so that's where we'll talk about snook, but you can apply it just about anywhere that snook exists. So, adult snook spawn, it passes where these red dots are, and this is again Charlotte Harbor. If you go to Fort Pierce Inlet, Sebastian Inlet, that's spawning spots for snook during the summer. Typically in the evening on a dropping tide, which is typically around a full new moon, that's when snook are spawning. They broadcast spawn. These green areas near the coast are the first places that we see those snook larvae. Okay, so if you go out there with a plankton nets, you can catch a snook larvae not long after the fish spawn. But then those larvae ride currents into the estuaries, and they're searching out mangrove creeks that have fresh water flow. Somehow, we don't know how yet, they're able to sense these areas. Too much flow, as you see coming out of these rivers, the Peace River, Myakka River in Charlotte Harbor, they can't get up into those rivers. There's too much flow for them. This is what a snook looks like when it first comes into the little mangrove creeks. Penny there for scale. And then once they start to take the snook shape, they're still kind of clear, which is great camouflage if you're out floating around in the open water. They start to look like actual snook. But you need really, really tiny lures to catch these guys. The next step up, and they're still back in these little mangrove creeks, and I'm going to get into more and more detail as we go along. That's my hand for scale. This guy is probably a couple months old. And we do actually sometimes, when we sample these, we would catch them this small with hook and line. As they grow up, they start to use more and more habitats throughout the estuary, adults migrating back out to the beaches for spawning, and this is what supports the fishery. But all those things I just talked about, remember? Inlet habitats, beach habitats, clean water in the estuary, fresh water coming out of mangrove creeks, mangroves themselves, all those habitats are required to make this, which supports the fishery. And most of what I just talked about is not involved in fisheries management. And that's the paradigm shift that we're trying to create by inserting this into management. Kicking and screaming all the way. So the types of questions that we ask about juveniles that are important to management, not just the science, but the management, are, do juvenile snook have home creeks? And scientifically, we call that site fidelity. If they have high site fidelity, that means those fish are homers. You catch them there, you recatch them there, that's where they hang out. What are juvenile snook survival rates? If 80% of them die from a particular creek, then that's probably not a good habitat. If 80% of them live, that's probably a good habitat. Then our next step is to figure out what are those characteristics that make those habitats good for the snook. Remember when I said that fish kind of move through the life cycle of different habitats? Snook get to a certain size and age, and they leave those protected backwater areas and start to enter the fishery. People can catch them They're exposed to predators like sharks and dolphins, those types of things. What portion of the juvenile snook in these places actually make it out, right, are successful? That's a huge question. And how is it all affected by habitat degradation, whether it's water flows or loss of habitat, that type of stuff? So back to Charlotte Harbor. On the eastern side of Charlotte Harbor, we've got two sets of creeks. The northern ones are, we'll call them healthy natural creeks. They're about as natural as you can get in Florida these days. In the southern portion, they're what we call degraded creeks because of habitat somewhat, but mostly because of water flows, which I'll talk about here in a second. So, a different way to look at it. You can see here there's some development in the uplands, but the entire mangrove area in this drainage area here is protected. It's all part of a state park, state preserve, Charlotte Harbor Preserve. So we'll call these water flows natural. The amount, the timing, and the quality is still pretty good. Not like 200 years ago, but still pretty good. In contrast, we have two creeks down here where their entire drainages are developed. So you have these creeks which each used to drain a few square miles. One of the creeks now drains 30 square miles. So it's a lot more water, and it's not nearly as good quality. So what we did is we put snook into a toll booth system. We put electronic tags called radio frequency identification tags. They're the same exact technology of what you have on your SunPass or EasyPass in your car. And then we constructed an antenna that went across the creeks, powered it with solar panels, and computers are on here. So anytime a snook swam through that antenna, it got picked up, just like driving your car through the toll booth. And each tag had a unique ID number. So we could tag fish, put these antennas throughout the creeks and tell exactly how many moved, where they moved, when they moved, address all those questions I already talked about. Just to give you an idea, this is the tag that we used, about an inch long. And we'd insert it, put a little slice in their belly, insert it in their abdominal cavity, and it's in there for good. And the nice thing about this is the way it works, again, same as EasyPass, is the antenna sends an electrical signal. That charges the tag, which then sends its signal back to the antenna. So these tags are glass encapsulated. They're in those fish for life. So if we catch a fish 10 years later, it still has a tag. We could tell where that fish came from. So back to the creeks again. This is a satellite image of the healthy creeks, just to give you an idea of what backcountry, the harbor's out here, seagrass beds, backcountry, the creeks go way back up in here. So in brief, the findings that we found is that 1-year-old snook, guys about this big, only 9.5% of them left the creeks, right? They figured, well, I'm too small, I'm not going to go out there and get eaten. And in doing some studies, we found that even adult snook, if they came across juvenile snook, they would eat them. Cannibalization rate in one of our studies is as high as 15%. So pretty big risk to leave these areas. If they left, it was late spring, early summer, and remember this will come back to us, and what we call a moderate return rate. So we think that most of the fish that left, that less than 10%, got eaten when they were out there and they didn't make it back. So it's safer to stay. 2-year-old fish, a little bit bigger. They're probably more like 16 to 18 inches. About a third of them left the creeks, same time period, but a super high return rate, something like 80%. Right? So they went out, they checked out different places, did a lot of feeding, but then they came back to those same sites. So what does this mean from a management perspective? It means that if you degrade or destroy a mangrove creek that's a juvenile snook habitat, you are taking away a specific portion of that snook population. And our job with managers is to figure out exactly what that is. So if you take away a certain creek, say in Charlotte Harbor, and we figured out that that's probably about 10% of the local snook population, that's a pretty big hit. And that's a pretty big trade-off for whatever that creek would be used for differently. So trying to put those numbers into management is pretty big. But there's also other ways to look at it, not just the way that fish move and how many survive, those types of things, but fish can survive but still not do well. So we wanted to look at diet. And this looking down the gullet of a snook from one of the creeks. Previously, when scientists did diet studies, they would kill the fish, open them up, look at their stomachs, count what different prey items were in there. But instead, what we do now is we pump their stomachs. They don't enjoy it. you imagine feeding all night and then somebody picks you up and pumps your stomach out the next morning? But it's a lot better than the alternative, right? So what we did is we sampled, I don't know if you can see in the back, 249 snook over a course of a year or so to see what was in their stomachs. And our idea was to compare those natural creeks to the impacted creeks. And remember, this isn't, if I took you on a kayak trip down these creeks, looking at the mangroves and everything else, you wouldn't know the difference. It was all about water quality. How much fresh water came in, when it came in, and what was in it. And a lot of the types of issues that we're seeing here in the Indian River Lagoon, it's all about those water flows. So what we found is when we looked at the number of stomachs from those snook that were full, they'd obviously eaten in the past 5 or 6 hours, the differences were pretty stark. So in the less degraded or more natural creeks, between 35 and 41% were full. If you look at all fish studies, fish that eat other fish like snook, if you get a 50% full stomach rate, that's pretty average. So these fish were pretty close to average. If you looked at those creeks that were impacted by altered freshwater flows, considerably less, in the 20s, right? So these fish were out there looking for food for just as long every night, but they weren't getting nearly as much to eat. So that's going to cause lower growth rates, lower what we call condition, or say health, or say body mass, and so their likelihood of being able to survive all those threats from predators is considerably lower. And it's these kinds of things. This is a sailfin molly, mosquito fish, other small fishes weren't nearly as abundant in these degraded creeks because of those water flows. The salinity or salt content of these creeks could change from, say, 30 parts per thousand, which is similar to the Gulf of Mexico or even the Atlantic Ocean at 35. We get a good rainstorm the next day, that salinity could be down to, say, 5 or 10, almost fresh water. And a lot of these small fish cannot handle that change, so those populations were low. But even worse, from my perspective, is the number of different prey species that they ate. So what we call this diversity of their diet. How diverse is it? Do you only eat hamburgers, or do you also eat salad and everything else, your vegetables like your mom taught you way back when? It's much more healthy to have a diverse diet. And this was even worse. In the more healthy creeks, they ate between 16 and 19, on average, different species were in the stomachs on any particular day. But check this out for the degraded creeks, right? Half. So they're working harder to get less prey, and the diversity is less. And a lot of this is because of things like shrimps and crabs and other things that they eat. These things like grass shrimp, if you change the salinity from, like I said, 30 down to 5, they're done. Okay, they either get swept out or they die from that drastic change. So you have whole portions of the food web in these impacted creeks that's not there anymore for these snook. And that has implications all the way down through the fishery. And we need to get this type of information into management. Okay, I'm going to switch gears here a little bit to the next species, and I'm going to be circling back a lot. So when I give lectures to students, I always tell them if I repeat myself, that's what's going to be on the test. So you're going to start finding me repeating myself now with different species. So very quickly for tarpon, which get up to 200-300 pounds. They're mostly a coastal fish, but when they spawn, they go offshore to spawn. There's a spot off of Boca Grande, Florida, about 120 miles offshore where they spawn. Does anybody know what this spot is? Deepwater Horizon. We've identified, colleagues have identified tarpon spawn right there. We don't know the impacts on what the Deepwater Horizon did, but it's not good. When they spawn, this is what their larvae look like. Okay, remember I said fish larvae don't look like their parents? This is an example. It's about this long. But you can see it's very clear, which is great camouflage in open water. The ocean currents sweep them back in, hopefully for them. They come into stinky backwater mangrove swamps, just like snook, right? I'm starting to repeat myself. If it stinks like sulfur, if it's mucky so you sink up to your waist and it's full of mosquitoes, perfect fish habitat. Unfortunately, historically in Florida, this is what was targeted for development. And we've learned since then that this is what drives Florida's fisheries. This guy's probably about 6 months old. My hand's there for scale again. As they grow, they start to use more open habitats, not the backcountry stuff, but a little bit wider creeks, just like snook. We get to this size, and that's when we start to see them in the estuaries. Like if you go fishing in Indian River Lagoon, once the water warms up, tarpon this size, if you know where to go, can be pretty abundant. And no, I'm not going to tell you where to go. No good fisherman would ever tell you where to go. So, what happens when you degrade habitats of juvenile tarpon? You guys are probably getting where I'm going with this, right? This picture on the left is from the University of Florida database of aerial photography. It's from 1951. This is Charlotte Harbor again. You can see all these little creeks and these little ponds that during the wet season, when you have a lot of rain, a lot of sheet flow of the water, but also higher tides, these ponds are connected to the creeks. And during those times, those little larval tarpon or the babies can get up into these ponds. The water recedes for the winter. They stay there. The water raises again next summer if they're lucky, and that's when they get out. Remember I said different habitats and migrations, right? This is that same exact spot now. Okay, so we've kind of lost that habitat. But here's the cool thing, is we've started with the Southwest Florida Water Management District and the Indian River, or the land trust over there, Lemon Bay Conservancy. We've started a restoration project here to try and bring this habitat back. And we'll have to see what happens, but we know that juvenile tarpon still go in there because we're doing work. The problem with that is when they do go in there, there's a lot more competition for food. Remember I said degraded habitats, not as much to eat. That means their growth rates are super slow. So that means when they reach about a year old, which is when they leave these backcountry habitats and move into those creeks, remember just like I showed you, the bigger habitats, they're a lot smaller than they should be, and so they're a higher risk for being eaten. So instead of being, say, 16 or 20 inches, they're coming out of this type of altered habitat at, say, 8, 10, or 12 inches, right? And so they'll fit in a lot more mouths at 8, 10, or 12 inches than they would at 16 or 20 inches. And so we're seeing those kind of effects. And again, we're trying to bring this back into the management realm. So how do we apply the knowledge, right? Science is great, but how do you apply it? So a couple examples. A colleague of mine, Joellen Wilson, is doing some work, and we actually have meetings with Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission biologists next month. She's working with fishermen and fishing guides. Remember, I told you fishermen never tell spots? They're actually telling us spots where they find juvenile tarpon because they understand the importance of this. Those spots are in Joellen's computer, which is locked. No hacking allowed. The next thing that we do, once they give us a list of locations, and we've got hundreds now, is we go in as scientists and we have to define which habitat characteristics make those habitats good. Is it mangrove cover? Is it the depth of the water? That type of thing. And so we do a lot of ground truthing. I shouldn't say we. We get graduate students to go mucking in mangrove swamps and get eaten by mosquitoes. And so once we assess them, we determine whether or not they're natural sites, as in they have high mangrove cover, good seagrass, all those types of things, or altered sites. And then that puts them on different management regimes. If they're natural sites, we're working now with Fish and Wildlife to identify them and put them on a list for protection. So if there ever is a proposal to, say, take a creek and develop into a marina, right away we can say, well, wait, no, this supports tarpon, which is worth hundreds of millions of dollars every year to the state. If, however, they are altered sites, then they are good candidates for habitat restoration, right? Because we already know tarpon are there, which means those larvae can make it there, but it's not good conditions for them to grow to make it to the next stage. And we've already got 4 different habitat restoration projects ongoing in Florida, and we're trying to add more. But here's the thing about this. The fisheries management side is all FWC. Okay, they're charged with managing the fisheries, that left side of the graph, or that chart I showed you with stock assessment and all that kind of stuff. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection is charged with managing habitats. Guess how much they talk to each other? Pretty much. So part of our job here is to force a paradigm shift, to force them to talk together. Because right now, if you were to apply to, say, take down mangroves and put up a seawall, DEP would come and assess that. And they'd assess that project independently, as if no one had ever taken out mangroves before. And they sometimes, but they generally don't consult FWC about how that particular mangrove habitat would have influenced the fish populations in the area. So we're involved in some interesting conversations right now to kind of try and change that paradigm shift. These two used to be in one department, but the last Constitutional Commission in Florida 20 years ago split them. And we're learning that that was a pretty big mistake, so we're trying to correct that. But we are putting information into that system. And just to give you an idea, all these stars are places, a lot of overlapping here, that the fishermen and the guides have shown us where they find juvenile tarpon. So we're starting to develop not only a list within Florida, but throughout the region and even into Central America and the Caribbean. And we're in conversations in Belize, Mexico, Bahamas, and elsewhere about incorporating habitat into their management plans as well. And now that you've seen the fishing spots, Dennis, close the doors. So again, here's the dichotomy, right? Natural habitats, we've got to do a better job of protecting them and quantifying how important they are to the fisheries. Altered habitats, we've got to focus restoration efforts. And this is actually a place over on the west coast near Boca Grande, Florida. That was going to be houses that would then connect to Charlotte Harbor in the Gulf of Mexico, which was abandoned. And the Water Management District over there is restoring those habitats specifically to become juvenile tarpon habitats, which to our knowledge is the first time that an agency in Florida has done that. So if we can kind of move that very slowly moving bureaucracy, we're getting more confident with that. Another piece of good news, which happened here, Tony, who was a student at FIT, now works at Harbor Branch. I don't know if Tony's in the audience or not. He took all that a step farther. What happened in Indian River Lagoon is decades ago, they realized that mangrove swamp created mosquitoes. And so to combat that, they would take a mangrove swamp, make a dike all the way around it, connect it with maybe 1 or 2 culverts. During the summer, mosquito breeding season, they would fill those mangrove swamps to water too deep for the mosquito to lay their eggs for the larvae to survive. And then during the winter, when things were dry and colder and the mosquitoes weren't breeding, they would open the culverts, and the water level would drop. That was called rim management. But the problem with that is, remember when I said juvenile snook left the creeks, right, spring and early summer? Guess when they closed off these mangrove impoundments from the estuary? May. And they were closed all the way through September, October. That time when all that connectivity for those juvenile and larval snook was happening. So we would have a lot of juveniles in here, but they weren't making those connections. So we would consider these bad juvenile habitats. Matter of fact, probably worse than bad, because the survival of these fish and their contribution to the next generation was probably much smaller than if they were in more marginal habitats that, higher chance of getting eaten, but at least they could move around. So what we were able to do is work with the Indian River County Mosquito Control District to change how they manage this particular impoundment up in Vero Beach, B-Gum, which is owned by Indian River Land Trust, which is another collaborator. So what happened is during the summer, 2 summers, first of all, they put in additional culverts so that they could have more water flow. But during that season in the summer when it was supposed to be closed, they opened up those culverts for, say, a week period to let water flow back and forth. And then they would close them again, pump the water back up, and resume their normal management so mosquitoes wouldn't bother people. So this is what they would look like, natural creek connections to the mangroves before, and this is what it looks like now. It's all through culverts, right? These are all separated. But once again, Tony used the same toll booth system with snook, but also with tarpon in this case. He could actually track fish moving in and out and knew exactly when they were doing this. And this is what he found, very condensed version of Tony's complex results. Juvenile snook were about 2.7 times higher emigration rate during what we call the revised management, when they opened it during the summer. So in other words, when they opened it during the summer, 2.7 times more snook, juvenile snook, took that chance to move out of that habitat, just like they would in a natural system, than during the entire winter season when there was 100% connectivity. And tarpon, very similar amount. So they could have gone in and out of these impoundments between October and May every year, every winter, and they didn't. But when we had the wet season and the warmer temperatures and we had those connections, we actually saw them emigrating. If they're able to survive in these places and move out into the estuary, that means they're contributing to the adult population, which then means these mangrove impoundments are good habitats. Okay, so we've demonstrated that now. So now the next step is to convince the mosquito control to revise how they manage all their impoundments So they do these seasonal, temporary types of connectivity, and that should help our population of snook and tarpon on this coast a lot. And if you compare the population of snook on the west coast to the east coast, the west coast population with a lot more connectivity of habitats is much, much higher than it is on the east coast. And our theory is that that's due to habitat. Okay, now I'm going to finish up with bonefish, which is a very special fish for Harbor Branch. And again, you can see the economic value, not just in Florida, but in elsewhere that I'm going to talk about. So working in the Bahamas, we wanted to figure out what were the important habitats, what were their home ranges, or how much site fidelity did they have, remember that term? What were their spawning locations, and what were the migration routes between where they lived as a home range and where they spawned. We did that a couple different ways. We used what we call dart tags. They have a pointy end that you basically stick into the musculature of the fish. It gets stuck among some little bones and sticks in there. Each tag has a unique ID number. So if somebody recaptures that fish, they call us and tell us when and where they recaptured it. And so this is a take-home message for this. In this, you're going to see a little bit of an animation. You're going to see dots of similar colors. Every dot, 2 dots of the same color are the tagging location and the recapture location of the fish. This is Abaco in the Bahamas. So watch as they come up. Very small home ranges. 70-some% of the fish that were recaptured within a couple kilometers of where they were tagged. So as adults, these fish, they have a pretty small home range. Okay, so from a conservation perspective, that's pretty good. Protect this area, you protect the population pretty well. But we need to figure out where they spawn, so we use a different type of tag called an acoustic transmitter, which is right here, about 1.5 inches for scale. It's similar to a radio tag, except radio frequency is essentially electrical current, and the electrical current in salt water is attenuated, disappears almost immediately. So instead, these send out a supersonic ping. The best way to think about it is a submarine movie, right? You hear the pinging and how they can detect other subs. And then we put out underwater listening stations, which is right here, and they can detect any bonefish that swims by. We surgically implant these tags. They last a couple of years. If that fish swims within about 1,000 yards of one of these detectors, receivers, it gets picked up, and it has a unique code, so we could track them. So what we found, I shouldn't pass up this. This is what a pre-spawning school of bonefish looks like. That's about, 5,000 or 6,000 fish. This is about 10,000 fish. And what we found is, even though bonefish have small home ranges and live in super shallow water, less than 3 or 4 feet deep, when they migrate to spawn, like this school, they actually go offshore into water thousands of feet deep in order to spawn. It's completely different than their home range. So what we found is, with all this tagging, we call this a home range. This is the general spawning area. And we tracked fish going down, and we tracked fish coming back. And when they come back to the same spot. And we're talking here that it's, this range is round trip 140 miles. It's not short. Now, I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people who go into a mall, they come out and they can't find their car. These guys, they're this big, they take these long migrations, and they can find their way back. And then next year, when they spawn again, they go to exactly the same place to spawn, which is pretty insane. But based on what I've talked about with all the habitat connections, you're starting to get the whole thing about connectivity, right? You could protect this, but if you don't protect that or in between, you're still in trouble. But the good news is in the Bahamas, they're listening. The Bahamas National Trust, which is their version of National Park Service, has created, based on these data, 6 new national parks specifically for bonefish, based on our tagging data. So, for example, this is that area I showed you on Abaco with the home range. Okay, this is the area that I showed you on Abaco with the spawning site. Those are both protected now. No development, no netting, all that type of stuff. And then other spots, spawning spot, and home range, the list goes on. And we're now working with the Bahamas government to expand this down island, hopefully adding another dozen or so of these within the next couple of years. So we're applying that knowledge. In Belize, we're a little bit behind, but the same exact methods I just described. I'm working with a colleague, Adiel Perez. This is a border between Mexico and Belize, right here. Same thing, though. Tagged there, recaptured there. In all these little circles, it's almost like there's little subpopulations of bonefish. So when we talk to them about protections, we're talking about some specific locations. But he's also got tracking between home range and, you guessed it, right, spawning location. So Adiel has, just this past year, identified a spawning location literally on the border. How is that for challenging? And so the good thing about Belize is they've already got a lot of protected areas. The bad thing is that their protection scheme doesn't quite match Bonefish. So I won't go all the different zones, different regulations. I'll focus here on where the spawning location is. That's in a, quote, protected area, but it's considered a general use zone. So there's no restrictions on harvest. And what I found in a recent trip there is the amount of coastal development that is occurring in this portion of Belize is indescribable. I can't even go there. There's entire beaches that were empty and are bonefish habitats, bonefish flats, that are now resorts, and they're even building little bungalow types of things out on the water, on the flats, which you can imagine how that affects the bonefish. $56 million a year U.S. in the Belize economy is huge. It's 3 times bigger than their commercial fishery. And it's all dependent on these habitats. So we're working with the government there to try and recover some of this. Cuba is a different challenge. Each of these circled areas is a marine protected area where only catch and release fishing is allowed. So anglers will go there from all over the world to fish for bonefish, tarpon, permit, snook, spend millions of dollars doing so. And the habitats are in amazing shape. The fish populations are in amazing shape. Outside of these protected areas, Cuba is severely overfished. More concerning to us for bonefish, this little star here, colleague Jorge Angulo from University of Havana and University of Florida, working with some colleagues here at Harbor Branch, Florida International, and elsewhere, they've identified a spawning location for bonefish right next to that protected area where the guys are netting out 20 tons of bonefish a year. So that's obviously not sustainable either. But now that we're getting this type of information, we can go back to the government and help them restructure some of this. 5, 6 years ago, we would have had nothing to say because we didn't know a lot of what I've told you now. So spatial protections, catch and release only, already said that. Okay, winding up here, bonefish in the Florida Keys, population decline. According to some guides who have been fishing in the Keys since the 60s versus now, some of them will tell you it's 90% smaller population than it used to be. And see how I'm repeating myself a lot? See the culprits? Water quality is big. The amount, the timing, all that stuff coming out of the Everglades is huge. Mismanaging the Everglades, like Okeechobee, is affecting not only Florida Bay, but the entire Florida Keys. Habitat loss is a big one. Some of the water issues in Florida Bay over the last handful of years, they've lost somewhere around 60,000 acres of seagrass because of the water issues. There's a lot of stuff going on with mangrove mortality as well. We're also starting to find out about a lot of contaminants from herbicides and pesticides. Copper, for example, a metal which interferes with things like reproduction. We're finding in unhealthy levels in some places in the Keys. More recently, pharmaceuticals, everything from anti-anxiety medications to opioids. And that's been shown in salmon to mess up reproduction, mess up migrations, make them not to fear predators. All the same effects it does to people, I guess. And we don't know about bonefish. We're going to start those studies now to see how much it's affecting our bonefish. These types of things, mangrove, this type of algae, right there, that tells you that it's a really sick system. And even working with fishing guides in the Keys, just to kind of give you an idea, Biscayne Bay, Florida Bay, the Florida Keys, some 75 till recently, if fishermen, career professional fishing guides would rate the fishery, 5 as top, 1 is 0, you can see from the 70s to now, it's basically gone from a 5 to a 1. And a lot of that's because of the habitat. So what we're doing with our Bonefish Restoration Research Project is to first identify and fix these environmental problems. And all the stuff I've shown you today, if I tried to give you this talk 15 years ago, I wouldn't have had that information. So we're getting a lot closer to identifying the causes. Now we have to go back. I'm not going to do this. I don't have the stomach for it. But we have people who go back into the political system and force regulations changes to make sure this restoration actually happens. Next, we want to learn how to spawn and rear bonefish in captivity. And the guys here at Harbor Branch are working very hard on this. And the reason is, remember I showed you those pictures of the big spawning bonefish schools? What it looks like is if those schools aren't a minimum size of, say, 1,000 fish or so, they won't successfully spawn. If we go out there and we study bonefish schools, spawning schools in the Bahamas, and there's 5,000, 6,000 fish, there's a lot of predators around, a lot of sharks, barracuda, but we don't see them eating the bonefish a lot, just overwhelmed, we think. If it's a few hundred, 500, 600 fish, the sharks and barracuda just tear them up, and we're not sure how many actually survive. So our concern is the Keys is there aren't enough fish in the Keys to reproduce successfully. And so our idea is if we can learn how to spawn them in captivity, as these guys are working very hard on, and they're getting a lot closer. If you have been watching Harbor Branch News, you know that earlier this month, these guys were able to actually get bonefish to spawn and hatch the eggs and rear the larvae for a few days, which is the first time that's ever happened to anyone in the world, which is pretty impressive. And as a field biologist and fisheries ecologist, I have to admit out front, I had nothing to do with that. That's all the guys from mostly in the back of the room there, groundbreaking stuff. But the goal is to have it in the toolbox if it's needed. So when we restore the habitats in the Florida Keys and the population is still low, we can use a short-term stocking to get the population back up and then step back and let the system run itself. So coming back to our elephant, right? We've connected a lot of the dots throughout here, but we've got a huge gap. Because even now, the way our system is set up, none of this system is going into management in Florida. There's no habitat in fisheries management for marine fish in the state of Florida right now. It's all about numbers of fish. And so that's our next big challenge, is to change that. So we get all the stuff I've told you about back into that system. So for the anglers in the audience, it doesn't really matter what you fish for in Florida. Any of these fish, bonefish, redfish, barracuda, whatnot, they all have similar dependence on healthy habitats, healthy water, and those habitat connections. So it's not just about the snook, the bonefish, and the tarpon I talked to you about today. It's about every single fish. And even if you go offshore and fish for grouper, guess what? A lot of those grouper species, they're juveniles, they're in estuaries. And a lot of them depend on seagrass in the estuaries. If you know about the Indian River Lagoon, how much seagrass is left in the lagoon right now? Not much. That is going to affect the grouper populations off the coast because they depend on that seagrass. So the repercussions, it's kind of like you throw a pebble into a pond. Those little waves, they spread out. And so that's why we kind of treat this as an urgent matter right now. We've got to have a paradigm shift to make sure we've got the economy, but also a lot of us moved here to Florida to do the fishing. People come here tourism for the fishing. So there's a lot of repercussions. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.